the Supreme Court chamber fell into stunned silence. What had just happened was unprecedented in modern judicial history. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, one of the most commanding voices on the nation's highest court, had just tried to cut off Representative Denzel Washington mid-sentence during oral arguments. But what Denzel said back left everyone in that marble-column chamber absolutely speechless. The tension had been building for months, but nobody, not the seasoned justices, not the packed gallery, not even the veteran court reporters, expected what was about to unfold. In just 30 seconds, a towering figure in American life would challenge the very foundation of how the Supreme Court conducts itself. And Justice Sotomayor's reaction would send shockwaves through Washington, D.C. The air inside the chamber was charged. You could feel it. Spectators who'd arrived hours early to grab seats knew instinctively they were about to witness something rare. Legal scholars in the gallery exchanged tense glances, and senior Supreme Court correspondents adjusted their recorders, aware they might be covering the most defining moment of their careers. Before we dive into this explosive confrontation that's already breaking the internet, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss a second of this political earthquake. This story has everything: power, politics, and two brilliant minds going head-to-head in the highest court in the land. But this wasn't just a legal disagreement. This was a generational reckoning when two public figures, each shaped by different eras and approaches to justice, collided on the nation's most sacred legal ground. And what Denzel Washington said next would either elevate his legacy or define it forever. At 70, Justice Sonia Sotomayor is one of the most influential liberal voices in the Supreme Court. Appointed by President Obama in 2009, she is the first Latina to serve on the court. Known for her fierce intellect, razor-sharp questioning, and passionate dissents, she has long been the conscience of the court's progressive flank. Born in the Bronx to Puerto Rican parents, her journey from public housing to Princeton and Yale law is legendary. She worked as a prosecutor, a private attorney, and a federal judge before taking her seat on the Supreme Court bench. And for more than a decade, she has carved her name into the nation's legal fabric. She doesn't suffer foolishness. She doesn't let soft answers slide. She's built her reputation on cutting through legal decorum with a scalpel of truth. Her dissents have echoed across the nation on issues from immigration to voting rights. But today, she wasn't facing a nervous young lawyer. She was facing Representative Denzel Washington. At 69, Washington represents a different kind of political voice. One born not just from legislation, but from lived experience, moral clarity, and cultural weight. A former civil rights advocate and community justice organizer, his political career came late but hit hard. He represents South Los Angeles, but his voice speaks far beyond it. Grounded in decades of community service, courtroom advocacy, and public speaking, Denzel isn't known for shouting. He's known for making rooms go quiet. He didn't enter politics for image. He entered because systems kept failing the people he had spent his life defending. Though he'd never argued in the Supreme Court before today, Denzel wasn't a stranger to courtrooms. His early work as a public defense advocate gave him a front-row seat to how justice on paper often collapsed in practice. He'd grilled executives before Congress. He'd stood up to power behind microphones and in broken neighborhoods. He didn't posture. He pressed. And now he was here inside the nation's highest court speaking on behalf of everyday Americans in Henderson versus Texas. A landmark voting rights case with the power to reshape redistricting across the entire country. As a senior member of the House Judiciary Committee, Denzel had been granted rare permission to present oral arguments alongside the Department of Justice, a decision that had already made headlines and raised eyebrows in legal circles. The stakes as high as they come. The court's ruling could either protect voting rights for millions or give states unprecedented authority to redraw district lines in ways that could silence minority voices for a generation. For Justice Sonia Sotomayor, this was everything she had fought for across decades of jurisprudence. For Representative Denzel Washington, it was about nothing less than the future of democracy itself. Neither was prepared to back down. For weeks, legal commentators had debated the unusual decision to allow a member of Congress to argue before the Supreme Court. Some called it a stunt. Others saw it as a long overdue evolution, a moment where the legislative and judicial branches would meet not in theory, but face to face. Justice Soto, in off-the-record conversations with legal journalists, had voiced reservations. As someone who had climbed the traditional legal hierarchy rung by rung, She believed the court's dignity required upholding certain protocols. The appearance of an elected official at the lectern, however credentialed, unsettled her. Denzel had spent months preparing, not with media consultants or political aides, but with constitutional scholars, former Supreme Court clerks, and civil rights lawyers who had stood where he now stood. He studied precedent, memorized decisions, and rehearsed rebuttals late into the night. He knew what he was walking into. This wasn't just about ideology. It was about being seen as an outsider. Not just by the conservative justices, but perhaps even by those who shared his values, but not his path. The stage was set. The clash wasn't just legal. It was generational. Institutional tradition versus lived experience, polished protocol versus principled fire. What nobody expected was how personal it would feel. The Supreme Court chamber buzzed with energy. The air carried a strange, reverent tension, like history was waiting to be made. Even the marble column seemed to stand straighter. A senior journalist, someone who had covered thousands of oral arguments, whispered, "This one's different." Justice Odmer took her place with her usual serene posture, but those who knew her well could detect the slight edge in her shoulders. She too had expressed concerns about breaking tradition, though only in private. When Representative Denzel Washington entered the chamber, the room shifted. He didn't walk in trying to own the space. He didn't wear a flashy suit or dramatic colors, just a tailored navy ensemble, clean lines, confident stands, quiet power. But there was no mistaking it. His presence changed the air. Chief Justice Roberts called the session to order. The formalities began. But from the moment Denzel approached the lectern and opened his mouth, everyone knew Burtonham this was not going to be a typical day in court. "Your Honors," he began, voice smooth, steady, not raised, but full of gravity. "I come before you today, not just as a representative of Congress, but as someone who has witnessed what happens when democracy bends and never fully snaps back." Justice Thomas leaned forward slightly. Justice Allow's pen froze. Even Justice Barrett looked up. But Justice Sotomayor's reaction was more subtle and more telling. Her jaw clenched just slightly. Her fingers tapped the bench once, then twice. Anyone familiar with her body language knew she disagreed strongly. As Denzel moved through his argument, laying out the constitutional framework for fair redistricting, the questions came fast and sharp. Justice Kavanaugh pushed on his interpretation of precedent. Justice Gorsuch pressed hard on federalism. But Denzel didn't rattle. He fired back with references, citations, real-world application. He didn't speak like a politician trying to play lawyer. He spoke like a lawyer who happened to have become something more. Then came a jab. "Representative Washington," Justice Allow said, his tone clipped. "Are you suggesting this corridor should discard decades of precedent based on your political ideology?" The gallery held its breath. A question like that could end arguments or define them. Denzel paused for half a second. Then he tilted his head and with a soft chuckle in his voice replied, "With all due respect, Justice Allow, I'm not asking you to rewrite anything. I'm asking you to apply the Constitution meet it was promised, not as it has been conveniently interpreted. Equal protection under the law is not a political stance. It's the whole idea." A few gasps in the gallery. Nobody talks to the court like that. But Denzel wasn't done. As his time continued, he weaved in stories, not slogans, not hypotheticals. Real people from his district, from neighborhoods torn in half by redistricting maps designed to divide, not represent. "Your Honors," he said, now leaning slightly toward the bench. "This isn't just theory. Every time this court rolls back voting protections, real people disappear from the conversation. Their voice fades. Their power vanishes. And then the moment Justice Sotomayor cut in, her voice sharp enough to crack glass. "Representative Washington, this court is not a political forum." Justice Sotomayor said sharply. "We deal with law, not anecdotes." The chamber froze. Even the court stenographer momentarily lifted her head from the keys. Justice Sotomayor continued, her tone tightening. "Your role here is to present legal arguments based on constitutional interpretation and precedent. Personal stories and political advocacy have no place in these proceedings." The rebuke echoed through the marble hall like a thunderclap. Later, veteran Supreme Court reporters would say they'd never seen anything like it. A liberal justice delivering a direct reprimand to someone aligned with her side of the ideological spectrum. And in public, no less. Representative Denzel Washington stood at the lectern. For a brief second, it looked as if the sting of that correction might pierce even his armor. A silence followed, long, cold, and full of scrutiny. And then Denzel smiled, not nervously, not defensively. It was the calm, composed smile of a man who had just been handed the moment he didn't expect, but had been prepared for all along. Justice Sotomayor, Denzel began, voice even low, and full of respect that didn't waver. With great appreciation for this court and for your remarkable service, I must respectfully disagree. A sharp intake of breath swept the gallery. A sitting congressman had just told one of the most respected justices in the nation she was wrong. To her face, Denzel stepped a little closer to the podium. His shoulders lifted, his voice carried. You said personal stories don't belong here. But wasn't it personal stories that shaped this court's most historic rulings? He paused, letting the question settle. Wasn't it the lived reality of Linda Brown that gave us Brown v. Board? The struggles of Clarence Gideon that gave us the right to counsel? Are we supposed to forget that those stories are the reason the law changed? Justice Sotomayor's expression gave nothing away, but her grip on her pen had visibly tightened, knuckles blanching against the wood grain of her desk. Denzel pressed on, not louder, just deeper. And if I may, Your Honor, he said, his voice like a gentle hammer, during your own confirmation hearings, you spoke proudly about your mother, about your diabetes, about how your life shaped your philosophy on justice. Were those stories irrelevant to your place on this bench? The room was silent enough to hear the faint hum of the air vents. Even Chief Justice Roberts, normally quick to intervene, didn't move. Denzel's voice didn't rise. It focused. I'm not just a lawyer today. I'm a congressman sent here by 760,000 Americans who don't have degrees from Harvard or Yale, who don't get to stand in this chamber, but who feel every election cycle the weight of maps that divide them, silence them. He motioned slightly toward the gallery where several of his constituents sat in silence. They can't quote footnotes from Shelby v. Holder, but they know when their voices have been erased. And they sent me here to speak on their behalf, even if that truth makes this chamber uncomfortable. Justice Sotomayor shifted slightly, leaning forward. But Denzel raised a respectful hand. If this court believes that the lived experiences of Americans are irrelevant to constitutional interpretation, then maybe we have to ask whether this court still understands who it serves. The words hit like a low explosion, silent but shaking the room. A member of Congress had just questioned whether the Supreme Court was still connected to the people it claims to serve directly to Justice Sotomayor's face. Chief Justice Roberts finally stirred, his voice stiff. Representative Washington, please confine your remarks to the legal questions before the court. But the impact had already landed. In under 2 minutes, Denzel had taken a public rebuke and turned it into a challenge, not to a ruling, but to the very role of the court itself. Justice Sotomayor sat back slowly in her chair, her eyes locked onto Denzel with a new intensity. Her authority wasn't shaken, but for the first time, it had been met with equal gravity. Her voice, when it came, was cool but weighty. Representative Washington, she said slowly, are you suggesting that this court's constitutional commitments should be subordinated to popular sentiment? It was a trap. Say yes, and he'd be accused of advocating mob rule. Say no, and he'd be retreating from everything he just stood for. But Denzel Washington had spent his career walking into loaded rooms with no safety net. From tough courtrooms to fractured communities, and walking out with respect. He was ready. Justice Sotomayor, Representative Denzel Washington replied, his voice steady and unmistakably clear. I'm suggesting that constitutional law, which ignores the real-world impact on American citizens, isn't constitutional law at all. It's academic theory, disconnected from reality. The words landed so directly, so confidently that Justice Tom actually looked up from his notes for the first time all session. Denzel continued without pause. This court holds the power to interpret the Constitution. But let's not forget the Constitution belongs to the people. And when this court makes rulings that systematically push voices out of democracy, it isn't protecting that document. It's undermining it. He turned slightly, gesturing toward the towering portrait of Chief Justice John Marshall hanging on the wall. Marshall established judicial review not to build an unaccountable aristocracy of legal minds, but to ensure that this Constitution lives to protect all Americans, not just the ones who can afford lawyers fluent in footnotes. Justice Soto's cheeks flushed slightly, whether from irritation or introspection, nobody could tell. But Denzel wasn't slowing down. In fact, he was just getting started. Your Honor, he said, locking eyes with her. You've spoken beautifully about how your upbringing in the Bronx shaped your judicial philosophy, about your mother's sacrifices, about how your life gave your decisions context and humanity. For a moment, Her stern face softened, caught off guard by the sincerity. Denzel nodded slightly, and I agree. I believe in that. Diversity of experience strengthens the bench. He paused. But if your story matters to the court, why don't the stories of the people affected by your rulings matter? If your journey is relevant to how you interpret the Constitution, why isn't theirs? Gasps were audible now, quiet and sharp. It wasn't a rhetorical flourish. It was a masterstroke. Denzel had taken the very principles Sotomayor had championed and used them to hold her accountable on her turf with her language. Several justices leaned forward slightly. The weight of the moment was unmistakable. Justice Sotomayor straightened in her seat, visibly preparing to speak, but Denzel moved first. Your Honor, if I may, I'd like to read you something. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out a small folded card, held it like a sacred object. This is the oath I took the day I was sworn into Congress. I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Then he looked her dead in the eye. That same Constitution that empowers you to interpret the law empowers me to represent the people. And when you tell me that their stories don't matter in this chamber, you're not just dismissing me, you're dismissing them. The room was electric. This was no longer a courtroom. It was a moral crossroads. Justice Kavanaugh tried to intervene. Representative, perhaps we could return to the specific legal. But Denzel calmly turned to face him. Justice Kavanaugh, the legal issue is whether Americans have equal voice in democracy. The constitutional issue is whether this court will protect that voice or silently dismantle it. And the human issue, one that cannot be separated from either, is whether the people I represent will have the same political power as someone living in a wealthier zip code. Justice Sotomayor, who had been silent for a beat, leaned in once more. Her voice when it came was no longer combative. There was something different in it now, almost curiosity. Representative Washington, she said slowly. What exactly are you asking this court to do? It was the shift Denzel had been waiting for. The moment where the tone moved from resistance to reckoning. Justice Sotomayor, he said, his voice like a slow crescendo. I'm asking this court to remember that every constitutional principle exists to serve real people. People who live paycheck to paycheck, who stand in long lines to vote, who feel the consequences of these rulings not in legal journals, but in their daily lives. He took one step closer to the podium. Posture tall, eyes unwavering. I'm asking this court to recognize that equal protection under the law isn't some abstract concept to be debated. It's a promise. And every time this court weakens voting protections, it breaks that promise quietly, legally, but devastatingly. Then he did something that would be replayed across news channels, podcasts, and congressional hearing rooms for weeks. He looked directly at Justice Sotomayor, not as a lawyer to a judge, not even as a congressman to a justice, but as one trailblazer to another. Justice Sotomayor, he said softly, you spent your life opening doors. You've proven that excellence doesn't wear one face, that our institutions grow stronger when they reflect the people they serve. The room held its breath. You've proven, Denzel said, voice calm but firm, that someone from the Bronx can rise to the highest court in the land and bring grace and wisdom with them. Justice Soto's expression, so unshakable just moments ago, began to shift. The towering judicial authority faded, replaced by something more human, more conflicted. Denzel took a half step closer to the bench, not to confront, but to connect. All I'm asking, he continued, his voice deep with sincerity, is that you extend that same respect to the people whose cases come before you. They may not quote legal theory. They may not wear robes, but they know right from wrong. They know what fairness feels like, and they deserve to be heard. Not just at the ballot box, but in courtrooms like this one, where their futures are decided. Justice Sotomayor sat still. The chamber waited in breathless silence. Every ear tuned to what came next. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed. Softer, measured, almost reflective. Mr. Washington, she said, you've given this court much to consider. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't a shutdown either. And in the rarefied air of that courtroom, it might as well have been an earthquake. She continued, perhaps the real question is not whether personal stories belong in constitutional interpretation, but how we weigh lived experience against legal tradition. Reporters in the back nearly dropped their pens reaching for their phones. A Supreme Court justice rethinking her stance mid-session was unheard of, but Denzel wasn't finished. With all due respect, Justice, he said, steady as ever, balance doesn't come from silence. It comes from inclusion. The legitimacy of this court doesn't come from distance. It comes from service. And you can't serve people you refuse to hear. You could hear the HVAC system hummel 5 seconds. Sotomayor said nothing. Then finally a slow, deliberate nod. Point taken. Mr. Washington, please continue. The shift was seismic. In less than 10 minutes, Denzel Washington had flipped a stern judicial reprimand into a turning point. The most respected voice on the bench had just admitted publicly that she was reconsidering. As Denzel stepped away from the podium, the atmosphere in the chamber was electric. Law clerks leaned forward. Reporters texted furiously. Students in the gallery just witnessed what their textbooks never could have prepared them for. Justice Sotomayor, who had started the day issuing rebukes from her perch, now listened differently, asking questions with more care, more openness. When Chief Justice Roberts finally brought the gavel down, the usual formality collapsed into a controlled chaos. Reporters sprinted. Legal experts whispered in huddles. No one was leaving unchanged. Within minutes, #WashingtonMayor was trending across every major platform. Law professors called it a constitutional reckoning. Politicians weighed in. Activists shared the clip. Late-night hosts teased reactions. And across the country, Americans who never thought they'd care about a Supreme Court session suddenly had something to say. The story wasn't over. But the narrative had shifted. Denzel didn't win the room by shouting. He won it by listening, by speaking truth, and by daring to challenge power respectfully but unflinchingly. Ready for the next part when you are. She now asked questions with genuine curiosity. The courtroom, once tense, had shifted, no longer a place of hierarchy, but of engagement. When Chief Justice Roberts adjourned the session, the usual quiet exit turned into chaos. Reporters rushed out. Legal scholars clustered in disbelief. Phones lit up. Headlines were already being written. Within minutes, #WashingtonBodto exploded online. Professor Lawrence Tribe tweeted, "In 40 years of Supreme Court observation, I've never seen anything like Denzel Washington holding court in front of the justices." This wasn't theater. It was legacy. Even conservative pundits offered respect. One wrote, "You don't have to agree with his politics to admit Denzel gave a masterclass in democratic accountability." The Supreme Court's normally quiet stream hit over 2 million views in 24 hours. Comments poured in. "I've never watched a court hearing before. But this felt like history. This man didn't just speak truth to power. He made power listen. This is what leadership sounds like." Progressives called him a hero. Civic educators began showing clips in classrooms. Law professors added it to their syllabi. At a legal conference days later, Justice Sotomayor spoke publicly. "Recently, I was reminded that the role of this court isn't just to interpret law, but to remain in dialogue with the people we serve." She didn't say his name. She didn't have to. Denzel Washington, meanwhile, didn't chase the spotlight. He returned to his district, met with high school students, held a town hall in a community center, and posted just one message. "We can't afford silence anymore. Ask the hard questions. Speak up respectfully, but without fear." That message alone garnered over 100,000 shares. Historians called the moment a modern Marbury by First Madison in spirit, a recalibration of how citizens and courts connect. Political analysts noted it reshaped how elected officials could engage the judiciary, not with deference, but with democratic clarity. The final takeaway: Washington didn't just make a legal argument. He reminded the court and the country who the Constitution belongs to. And in a time of division, he proved that the loudest voice doesn't always carry the room. Sometimes it's the one that listens first and then speaks with purpose. In democracy, no institution is above respectful challenge, and no voice is too small to be heard.